Hello, it's Ruby, and today I'm going to be doing a wrap-up and review of all of the books I read in January. This month I read 17 books, which I'm extremely happy about, actually. At the beginning of the month, I will set a goal of a specific book, like a classic or a more challenging book, which I wanted to read for a long time. So this month, I really wanted to read Wuthering Heights, which was the first book I read this month, and also The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, which has been on my TBR since I was maybe 13 or 14, like a really long time. So I started The Brothers Karamazov halfway through the month on like the 15th or 16th of January. And as you can see, I have not finished. I'm currently on page 407. I'm on book 8 of part 3, and I'm loving it so much so far, but I have just been really slow on reading it. I find that it takes quite a lot of focus, so sometimes in the evening I don't feel up to reading it because I know that I'm not going to appreciate it as much if I'm too tired. So I've mainly been reading this one in the mornings, and I'll give you a review of this in February instead because I think it'll be better to review it all together. So that's book 0.5. It doesn't count, but I'll talk about this next month. Okay, so book number 1 was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, which was a reread. I read it for the first time when I was 13 and just didn't really like it that much. Maybe that's to be expected. I just don't think I was old enough to appreciate and value the language. I did like it. I liked it more than I did when I read it for the first time. I still definitely would not say it's my favourite Bronte book. 10 to Wildfire Hall is number 1, and I preferred Jane Eyre. I preferred Villette. Not to say Wuthering Heights is bad at all. I did like it, but it's just in comparison to the other Bronte books I've read, I didn't like it as much, which is a big distinction because the Brontes are excellent. Even if you haven't read Wuthering Heights, I'm sure that you've heard the name of the book, but maybe you don't know the storyline. In very, very basic terms, it's about a boy, Heathcliff, who is found and adopted by this family, and he falls in love with Cathy. Cathy is higher status than Heathcliff, and so you find this like class boundary between the two. But they fall in love and basically spend their lives trying to reconnect, trying to come together. It's a story about very intense and feeling love, and Bronte also explores the darker sides of love, I suppose. The dangers of it and the havoc that it can wreak. So halfway through, for example, spoilers, halfway through we see first generation Cathy going mad because of Heathcliff and her love for Heathcliff. I know it's not a pure and fairy tale-ish romance. It's very dark, very real. The other thing which is really strange about this book is I like books when you don't like the protagonists and you don't like the main characters, because it's always much more interesting. It's fun to be critical. It's fun to have characters that seem very human, very flawed. But oh my gosh, first generation Cathy, I just found her so infuriating. I love Heathcliff. I think he's so cool, and he's so like, he's got so many layers to his character, and he isn't afraid of admitting that he compares himself to the devil. Like, he's not afraid of admitting his faults. The thing that annoys me about Cathy is that she's slightly more defensive. In some ways she's as bad as Heathcliff, and yet she would never admit that. And so she does kind of annoy me. I like her towards the middle of the book, but yeah, I don't like her. And because I really didn't like first generation Cathy, I did find the first half of the book quite hard to get through just because she really annoyed me. Let me know if you agree. But the second half of the book I liked much more with second generation Cathy. Oh, but my favourite part is the descriptions of the moors. Emily Bronte and her sisters actually are so great at setting up the space, describing the space, and those darkening moors, like the mist on the moors which is described, is just exquisitely done and so atmospheric. This book is loved and has withstood the limits of time. I think because it is an unorthodox portrayal of love. Heathcliff is not the perfect man. He is far from the perfect man, and yet Cathy still adores him. She is still in love with him. Vice versa, Cathy is very annoying, and yet Heathcliff is desperately in love with her. And just broadly, this idea is very powerful because Emily Bronte is effectively arguing that everyone is capable of love, and everyone is capable of being loved as well, which is a really powerful like kernel to have at the heart of this book. I would recommend it if you've read other Bronte books, if maybe you liked Rebecca. It's kind of got Daphne du Maurier feel to it, but if you are just going straight into reading the Brontes, I would recommend starting with Jane Eyre. Alright, next is Five Survive by Holly Jackson. Holly Jackson wrote A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, if you didn't know, and if you haven't read it, you need to read that. So I actually did a readathon with my best friend Blakeney. We read this whole thing locked in a van because the whole book takes place over the course of 8 hours in real time, and it's a kind of murder mystery. It's not a murder mystery. What's the word for it? So basically they're on this road trip through America and their van breaks down in the middle of the night. It's 6 teenagers on this trip. And the van breaks down, all of the tyres have gone down, like the petrol tank has been shot through, and they basically realise that there is a gunman who is waiting there with a gun, like has it pointed at the van, and he says that 5 will survive, but only if they uncover like the secret that one of them has. So one of them has a secret, one of them is hiding something. The group spends the next 8 hours trying to figure out whose secret it is. Obviously lots of secrets come uncovered, everyone has something to hide, kind of along the lines of One of Us is Lying. So it's really great at kind of getting under the surface, I guess. It's really fast paced, definitely plot driven, even though it takes place in a van in 8 hours. It's somehow just so intense, and like you can't stop reading even when she's going to the toilet and stuff. Admittedly though, it did start off kind of slow. I think the first hour, like the first part of the book, wasn't quite so exciting. Okay, so in terms of the characters, Oliver is one of the just worst, most horrible characters I have ever met. He is genuinely up there. He might be my least favourite character of all time in a book. He is just so infuriating. He's got this massive power complex where he thinks he's better than everyone. He thinks his opinion counts for everything, and he's just so annoying. If you've read Five Survive, please tell me in the comments what you thought of Oliver and how much he annoys you, because I just don't understand how anyone can like him. And we're not supposed to like him. And there's also Red, who's maybe the main character of the book. I don't know, at the beginning I wasn't the biggest fan of her, but very quickly I grew to really like her as a character, and I just like how she's very openly different. She does rely on others a lot, and she doesn't take steps to protect herself, which can be quite frustrating to read at times, but we really tangibly get a sense of how her mother's death has affected her. It is excellently done. I like how Holly Jackson isn't just getting us to feel sorry for her, instead she is very human. She does the complexity of Red very well. However, having said that, characterization in this book wasn't particularly prevalent, and I do think it's because of the plot was having to drive so much. Like there was so much stuff that was happening that there wasn't really time to get like character arcs for each of the characters. You semi get this with Red and maybe with Oliver, but it's like you only really get as much information about the characters as you need, and that's not a bad thing. It's just something which is maybe different to books that I usually read. They were believable characters even though they weren't fleshed out. Like they felt like they were like alive and breathing, but you just didn't really know very much about them. My favourite books tend to focus on character development as opposed to like straight plot, but I did like this. I would highly recommend this book. Blakeney and I did end up reading this in about like 3.5 hours to 4 hours instead of the 8 hours, so it obviously does depend on your reading speed, but it was so funny. We literally got to the last page at the exact same time. Like sometimes one of us would be a little bit further ahead and it kind of like switched over the course of the 4 hours, but at the end we were literally reading the last page at the same time, and then we looked up and we realised we both had finished at the same time, which is quite funny. Anyway, I've actually got a meeting now, so I'm gonna have to stop filming and get back to you afterwards to talk through the other 15 books, but I will see you soon. Alright, I'm back now. Okay, so the next book books that I read were 2 middle grade books, and I actually read these both for work. So the first one is A Kind of Spark by Ellie McNichol, and this is about a young autistic girl. She's in year 7. This is about a girl in year 7. She's autistic and she's learning about the witch trials at school, and as she learns more about them, she realises that the reason they were persecuted is because they were different, and she kind of comes to this conclusion that had she been alive in the 17th century, she would have been burnt as a witch. And so she starts rallying the town to remember these witches, remember what happened, kind of own that accountability, and give voices, give remembrance to these people who were burnt. The book does an excellent job of showing why history is important, why it's important to learn history, why it's important to uncover story, because the events of history are being used to uncover kind of human truths, things that are still true today, a priori truths, as opposed to just like as opposed to something that just happened. It's something which is continuing to happen today, and which we can recognise historical events in the present day. And there's actually a subplot of Addie's sister's friend Bonnie, who is also autistic, and she's been locked away in a mental institution because she was thought to be dangerous, even though she's not. So the book is doing a really great job of drawing these things together. It's also able to teach kids about autism in girls. We hear a lot about autism in boys, but not so much about girls, and sometimes it does feel a bit heavy-handed because it will be through dialogue a lot of the time, both through Addie and her older sister Keely. Is her name Keely? I think it's Keedy. Her older sister Keedy, both of them are autistic, and so they'll explain tropes of autism to other characters, therefore also the reader. And even though this can feel a bit clunky, it's also a great kind of way for kids to learn about autism, and maybe just to be more understanding of anyone that they know who is autistic, or of themselves as well. So it talks about stimming, overstimulation, masking, meltdowns, hyperfixation, and as I say, it might seem tiresome and repetitive, but I realise that's because I'm an adult reading this, and I know more about autism in girls than like an 11 or 12-year-old reading this would. So I think this is a key book for young readers, one I would definitely recommend if you know anyone around like year 6 to 8. And then the other book I read was King of Shadows by Susan Cooper, which is about a boy called Nathan Field. If you didn't know, Nathan Field was a boy actor in Shakespeare in England. He was quite famous actually. He played Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's a modern Nathan Field who is about to travel to London and play Puck at the Globe. But he somehow travels back in time and ends up in Shakespearean England, and everyone thinks he is Nathan Field from the 16th century, and so he performs Puck with the original cast, like for the first time at Shakespeare's Globe, and he meets Shakespeare. And this book is honestly so great at creating Shakespearean England. It's so vivid, the detail, the research is incredibly strong, and for younger readers to then read that, they're approaching then Shakespeare, like any later English study, with a very solid grounding. Like, this is a great book for kids to read before studying Shakespeare. I will say it's better as a learning resource than a work of fiction, because its intent, you can tell, is to do that, is to kind of prepare kids for studying Shakespeare. And it just kind of feels very clearly that that's the purpose. I can't even put my finger on what exactly it is about the writing, but it's leading with the education as opposed to leading with a story, if that makes sense. Doesn't mean it's not good. As I say, the world building of Shakespeare in England is so great that I would recommend this. But it sometimes just feels a bit, there's just something not quite right about it. However, the ending is excellent. Doesn't make entirely loads of sense, but actually becomes quite philosophical, raises some key questions. Oh, and also one thing that did bother me is the extent of Nathan's relationship with Shakespeare. Like, he knows Shakespeare for like a week, and he ends up talking about him like his father, or like a father figure, and they become incredibly close. And I mean, yes, it's possible that you can become that close with somebody in the space of a week, but it's quite unrealistic, and it just bothered me slightly, because it's unlikely that would have happened, but it's also unlikely that somebody would have travelled back in time, so I feel like it's not maybe a valid criticism to make. Next, I read The Collectors by Philip Pullman. So Philip Pullman published, he wrote his Dark Materials, and he wrote these 3 short story book things to subsidise the series, and it's just stories that are set within the world. They're not really connected directly to the plots, but it's connected to the world. So in The Collectors, you see these two scholars at Oxford sitting down and discussing two pieces of art and the mysterious relationship and history between them, where they always seem to end up together. And Pullman basically links this to the world that we know from his Dark Materials. I didn't think it was that good. I love Pullman's writing style, and I like his setting of Oxford, but it's very slow, and I feel like it's only good in the context of his Dark Materials. That's kind of its only saving grace. I would probably give this book like 2 stars. Alright, so the next book is one which lots of people have been asking for my thoughts on, and I am going to keep this quite vague, but I did read Spare by Prince Harry, and people kind of jumped on me a bit for saying that I read it for cultural reasons, saying it's not a cultural book, but I would argue that it definitely is, because just because something is pop culture related as well doesn't mean that it's not culturally significant. Shakespeare was pop culture. He's incredibly culturally significant. I wanted to read this because it was in the media so much. I was hearing claims of what the book was saying and doing, but I hadn't read it myself, and it just I don't know, there's something, it feels hypocritical to just listen to what other people are saying without reading it too. So I guess I just wanted to form a better opinion of what I thought on the whole thing, which is why I read it. I wouldn't say I really enjoyed it. No, not even, I wouldn't say I didn't enjoy it. I didn't think it was a very good book. But I am glad that I read it, because I do stand by the fact that it is historical. Like it or not, the royal family does have a historically and culturally significant place in British culture. Prince Harry is shedding light on and talking about an institution which remains incredibly private. I'm interested in what this account means for the royal family, because inevitably it is going to change the way that it operates, because that level of privacy no longer exists. So I just wanted to see the extent to which that privacy had been breached, I suppose. It's embarrassingly personal. I know that on social media, online, I've seen particular audios and particular passages popping up again and again to illustrate this point, but some of it you're reading it and you're thinking, why has this been written? So yeah, some bits are very odd. What I will say though, and one thing which I haven't really heard in the reviews and media accounts, unsurprisingly, I wouldn't say that this book is an attack on the royal family. I'd say that this book is an attack on the press and media outlets. The book is effectively criticising the press for being too invasive, blaming the press for his mother's death, and also all of the hate that Meghan received. No matter your opinion on the royal family, no matter your opinion on Harry and Meghan, I do think objectively there's something very wrong about that. So yeah, journalists maybe don't want to take that angle when writing about the book and saying yes, it's an attack on the paparazzi, but that's what it reads as. Oh, and in terms of whether you should read it, no, honestly, don't waste your time, don't waste your money. It's not worth it. It's a mammoth book, and the writing is not very good, to be honest. It's very disjointed. It's, instead of being written like a story, or kind of even like a normal memoir which tracks through some kind of coherent, not even plot, but just a line of progression. This is just random events which have been plonked next to each other. Alright, so next I read another middle grade book, which is The Monstrous Child, but it's basically taking Norse mythology and rewriting it for modern audiences, making it funny, making it relatable. The main character is Hel, and she becomes goddess of the underworld, queen of the underworld. She's been sent there by the gods. She doesn't want to be there. It's really great to have the perspective of a villainous character here, because she's incredibly dislikable, and she doesn't care about anyone basically. But you can also understand why she is so bitter, so you're humanizing the villain, but at the same time you really dislike her, and I think that's a really hard line to tread. But this book does that very well. She didn't want to be the Queen of Hell, and yet she ended up the Queen of Hell, and she ends up in this really dank, dark underworld with only the dead for company. I mean, of course you feel sorry for her. I also love how it plays with time, how all time becomes equal. There's no difference between a couple of seconds and a millennia, because there are no events to pull time apart. It takes no time at all, but also all of the time in the world for her servants to bring her wine or whatever. And it really broaches this question of what is time, in a really kind of fun, amusing, exciting way for kids. Next, I read Gen Z Explained. I read this because I spoke on a panel at King's about Generation Z and the launch of this book, which was really good fun actually. I thought it was an interesting book. Academics looking at Generation Z and kind of using testimonials and surveys to kind of see what other generations can learn from Generation Z. And I like how actual young people and students have been kind of have their voice put into this book too, verbatim. It's a cool form of research. I would say though that I'm not the target demographic for this, so a lot of the things in this book seem very self-explanatory, very basic, very to the point, because it's things like meme culture or like social media, things that I know about. So it's written for a different generation, but there are some good arguments, and I particularly like the parts on religion and cancel culture. Next, I read the Family Curse Field Notebooks. These are very, very short. They're 60 pages long. This person who's gone to clear out their mum's house, and they find this booklet, and there are all of these rumours surrounding their family, and they have been targeted by fairies and aliens, and there's just kind of something supernatural going on. They don't know what to make of this, but they start looking around in the loft and they find these like diaries and records from the 1960s and the 1800s, and then these are embedded within their narrative. So you have like narratives within narratives, and it feels very Frankenstein-esque in that way. I also love how you have different interpretations of the same event. So back in the 1800s you have like changeling mythology and fairies, and then in the 1960s there's aliens, and it's cool how the same thing can be approached in different ways. It's a really, really short booklet. Literally you read this in one sitting, but it's good if it's like a cozy rainy night and you just want something spooky. Next, I read A Place Called Perfect, which is another middle grade book. This one it started so good. Like, it started so strong, and I love the world, and I love the idea, and I love the whole premise, and I love the character. But just like the actual story, I feel like halfway through it just kind of lost me. So it's a really clever premise about a town called Perfect, where everything seems perfect. So people wear these rose-tinted glasses, which basically make everything look more perfect. Like, everyone bakes amazing cakes and everything's shiny and there's no litter and the children are really well behaved. The main character moves here with her family, and her parents start to turn weird as soon as they get there. I do like the premise of it. As I say, I love the world building. I think it's really clever. It's getting kids to challenge authority, not accept things at face value, question what they see, which is really always a valuable message. The main character, the girl, is fantastic. She's a great, like, fiery young girl. So I like the story, I like the world, but I do not like the plot. I just kind of lost interest. The pacing felt a bit off. If they'd cut 100 pages from the middle, it would have been much better. But again, I have to take these books with a pinch of salt because I'm reading them as an adult as opposed to like the target audience. Alright, so next I did a readathon. So I've actually spoken about all of these books already. I don't know if I'll go into too much depth about them because the whole of my Bronte readathon video I was talking about these, but I read a few books for that. So I read Bewick's British Birds, which is one of the first books of its kind. An amazing undertaking, categorising and cataloguing birds for the first time. So you have these gorgeous, beautiful woodcut illustrations of land birds and water birds, and then a description of what they look like, and sometimes for some of them their breeding patterns, their like superstitions about them. So for like the nightingale, house martins, robins, the ones that are most popular, there are stories about them, pieces of literature. I said this in the other video, but I just wish there had been less on the way that the birds look and more on their migration patterns, breeding patterns. But someone did point out on the video that that's an anachronistic thing to wish for, because this was the first book of its kind, so that information was new. It's just that it's so easily accessible today. Yeah, but it's a beautiful thing to look through. It's the kind of thing that you could just dip into. On that readathon, I also read The Pilgrim's Progress. Not going to go into this too much, but I didn't like this book. I'd give it 1 star. Lots of people in the comment section actually were saying that they did enjoy it when they read it. I like it from an intellectual standpoint, and the theological allegory of Christian making his way to the celestial city. I think it's clever, but I just do not like the writing style. I found it very boring, very basic. I like books that play with language, which have like vibrant, strong images, and Pilgrim's Progress just didn't have that for me. I can't think of a single like standout image which was conjured. World building, like kind of building of the space, is very important to me when reading. I also read The Pleasure of Hating by... I don't know what happened to the end of that clip, but I was going to talk about The Pleasure of Hating by William Hazlitt. Don't think it's a good life philosophy to adopt because it is so cynical and takes a very cynical view of human nature, which even if It is true, it's not a productive way to look at the world, but Hazlitt is a very engaging writer and I definitely want to read more of his essays, having read this one. Also for that readathon, I read King Lear. Oh my gosh, this is so excellent. In my top 3 Shakespeare plays, my top 3 Shakespeare plays are King Lear, The Winter's Tale and Macbeth. I love his tragedies. King Lear is just so emotional. I still can't stop thinking about that final scene. That moment when King Lear comes out with Cordelia, like the strength of the relationship between father and daughter there, it's beautifully done, beautifully captured, and so emotional. I really want to see it kind of performed on stage and see that relationship played out on stage. As I said in that video too, I just love Cordelia as a character. She's so fiery, so strong, so independent, and she's not afraid to be contrary to people, to actually like speak her mind. Then the final book that I read for that readathon was the poetry of Alexander Pope, which I finished like the selected poetry. This had some letters, some poems in, and I think he's a lot like Walter Scott, the Scottish poet. I think that it's kind of contentious as to whether he is a romantic poet or not, because I read somewhere that some places that he is and then other places that he's not. He does definitely have the tropes of some of the romantics, especially in his nature poetry, and he's nostalgic in the same way as the romantics, but much more nostalgic for like Greek, for the Greek world, the Greek myths, which is different to someone like Wordsworth. Pope, I mean, I wouldn't say I'd be in a rush to read any more of his work anytime soon, but I did like what I read, and I especially liked his letters. I would actually quite like to read some more of his prose. Alright, so the penultimate book I read is The Wolves of Willoughby Chase, which I borrowed from my friend Blakeney. This was one of her favourite books when she was a child, and I never read it, and she said, Ruby, you need to read this book. How did you not read it when you were younger? And I wish I'd read it when I was younger, because I know I would have loved it. It takes all of the key tropes, basically, of children's literature, especially literature for girls, and puts it literally all together in one book. I don't even understand how they managed to do it. It's like every chapter is a different main trope of children's literature. It's this girl who lives with her aunt who's very old, and then she goes to live with her cousin in this massive mansion in the middle of nowhere, which is surrounded by snow and wolves, and if you stray out too far, then the wolves will basically run and eat you. Her aunt and uncle, like her cousin's parents, leave. They are put under the care of this evil governess, and basically things just get worse from there. But I loved this book. It moves very, very quickly. The pace is very quick. Commend it to anyone who liked like A Little Princess, I suppose. Very unrealistic, but so what? I mean, it doesn't matter that it's unrealistic. Okay, then the final book that I read in January is The Queen's Gambit, which I had been wanting to read for ages because I loved the show, and yeah, I just wanted to read the book, which I should have read beforehand. The show and the book are very similar. It's like the show has taken the book and like literally just put it on screen, and because of that, if you watch the show, I wouldn't say that reading the book is a must. It's not like a necessary thing to read if you love the show. However, if you just want to relive the show, you don't want to rewatch it, but you kind of want to rewatch it, then maybe just read the book instead. It's so like the show that it's literally like watching it again. However, it is more problematic than the show, and there were some racist moments and comments made, which were uncomfortable to read, and I will kind of leave that as a trigger warning. I will say I wasn't expecting to find chess moves so exciting. Like, obviously you see that in the show and you watch them play chess, but in the book you literally hear Beth talking about the individual pieces which are being moved, and I feel like I understand more about chess as a result of reading the book. It kind of tells you more about chess than the TV show does. And just as a character, I love Beth. She's again like kind of complex as a character in that sometimes she is dislikable, but I just love her independence, her stoic nature. She seems very apart from other people, but this kind of gives her an elegance. I mean, that image of her as a female figure, as a woman, overtaking the male world, overtaking like this very male space of chess and usurping them in the same way that you'd like work through a chessboard. The whole book, her kind of like the social dynamic is like a chess move in itself, which is why it's called The Queen's Gambit, I suppose. It's her and Mrs. Wheatley against the others, her against a room full of men And there are men like Benny who help her, but in the end it's her, and that's so powerful. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I do really like making book release. Let me know if you liked watching this. Potentially I'll make one for February too. And yeah, wish me luck with the Brothers Karamazov, which I will finish before next month. It is really good. I'm just taking it very, very slowly. Anyway, thank you again for watching, and I hope that you have a productive week.